Welcome to Australia about 50,000 years ago. If you thought it was a scary place today, let me introduce you to the locals now. 200 kilogram, 2 metre tall kangaroos, marsupial lions and koalas far too big to be cuddly, dragon-like lizards, giant birds and the giant diprotodon. It's truly another world due to being cut off from the land masses of Eurasia and Africa, where an even more terrifying species of intelligent ape has risen to the top of the food chain, owing to its ability to work in groups effectively and use tools. Most of the megafauna on these continents have been killed, but luckily for you guys in Australia, these humans would have to cross the ocean to reach you, so we can continue with a questral summary of Australian biology, unless they learn to cross the water or something ridiculous. Oh shit, you guys are going extinct. So the arrival of the first humans in Australia is as significant historically as the moon landing or the European discovery of America. It marked the first time that our species crossed the sea to a new continent, and although some claim it was due to climate change, it seems quite suspicious that over the next millennia, 23 of the 24 Australian species weighing over 50 kilograms, which had survived numerous ice ages, went extinct. So I think we know who the culprit is. Some humans crossed over on a land bridge from New Guinea, bringing the Palmer-Nuangan language family, and others are perhaps related to the Austronesians of Indonesia. And over in Eurasia, however, as early as the days of Aristotle and Ptolemy, people knew that the Earth was a globe. And looking at a map, these thinkers noticed that there was a lot of land on the top, so figured that the northern hemisphere was too heavy, so it stood to reason that there was a terra australis incognita, meaning unknown southern land. It sounds ridiculous nowadays, but fair enough, and whilst their reasoning was flawed, they were right. Unknown to Europeans, for the entirety of their history, the Aboriginal population had lived in Australia and the islands of the Torres Strait in extreme isolation from all of the great stuff going on in Europe and Asia. And as such, they were one of the oldest and most unique cultures in the world, with a wide variety of languages, the religious practices of Dreamtime and most famously boomerangs. For their history, the Aboriginals were Stone Age hunter-gatherers, although they did develop agricultural and land management practices. They maintained oral traditions and legends relating to their people, but due to this, and quite similarly to a lot of my European videos which only really begin with the arrival of Rome, the common narrative of Australian history begins with my countrymen, or my neighbours paying a visit. So in the early 1600s, during the Age of Discovery, explorers from Portugal, Spain, England, France and the Netherlands rushed to discover the mysterious continent on the other side of the world. And in 1606, the Dutch navigator Willem Janszoon landed in the Cape of York Peninsula. First contact with the natives turned violent when 10 Dutchmen and a number of Aboriginals were killed, and future contact was mixed. In the years that followed, many Dutch voyagers mapped the continent, and in 1644 they named it New Holland. And although the Dutch were the first to reach this continent, they made the smart decision, and decided to have absolutely nothing to do with this hellhole. Over a century later, the British Empire was losing its influence in America, and so they dispatched Captain James Cook to claim Terra Australis Incognita over Britain. He landed at Botany Bay in 1770, claiming the eastern side of the island for Britain and naming it New South Wales, because it does bear a shocking resemblance. And in 1788, having lost the 13 colonies in America, Britain needed somewhere to, among other things, send their convicts, and the first fleet with some 1,000 people established the penal colony of Sydney on January the 26th of that year, which is now known as Australia Day. Lots of criminals were sent to labour for the greater good of the British Empire, strategically and economically, and due to this, settlements such as Melbourne and Brisbane popped up along the southeast coast. But colonisation was slow and painful, and the colonists suffered from disease, mismanagement and conflicts with the native population. Also, as any nightclub chav would say, the ratio was not it, brev, and women made up a small and quite vulnerable part of the population. Being a convict colony, there were naturally uprisings, and the free cities of Adelaide and Perth were also established by an increasing number of free settlers which swelled the population, and rum was even briefly used as a currency in the British colonies on the landmass which was coming to be known as Australia. Frontier wars with the Aboriginals occurred, killing vast amounts of the native population, and smallpox introduced by the Europeans killed many more of them since they had no immunity to this disease. In the 1850s, a gold rush drew hundreds of thousands more free settlers from Europe, America and China, and the population exploded. This brought racial tensions to the continent, and the influx of immigrants transformed Australia from a largely convict country into a modern one, and brought about the new ideas of self-determinism and enlightenment to the cities of the continent, outside of which was pretty much a Wild West. But these ideas resulted in the Eureka Stockade by the gold prospectors against the colonial elite, who were seen as corrupt and to be running the colony poorly. This is an important moment in the Australian psyche, and brought about the idea that Australia could be more than a colony. The rest of the 19th century brought decades of economic boom, in which Melbourne briefly became the second largest city in the empire. Suffrage for all men and sometimes women and Aboriginals was introduced, which once again sounds very basic, but in the context of the time it made Australia an extremely progressive place, It's just great. I love women's suffrage so much. I'm 6'1", by the way, so we should do it. However, at the turn of the century, for God's sake, you were doing so well. The White Australia policy was introduced, which restricted non-white immigration before World War II, due to unrest with the Chinese settlers. And in the years that followed, there were attempts to breed out the Aboriginals, which has come to be known as the Stolen Generation. This was after January the 1st of 1901, when the Federation of Australia was proclaimed as a nation under the British Empire, and still recognised Queen Victoria. Canberra was chosen as a compromise between Melbourne and Sydney, now just looks like the most mid-capital city in the world. And during World War I, being a part of the British Empire, Australia declared war on the Central Powers alongside its mother nation, sending the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps known as Anzacs to Europe for their baptism of fire. 500,000 young Australians volunteered, and the troops of the young nation took the German colonies around New Guinea, and were sent to fight the Ottoman Turks in the brutal fighting of the Gallipoli campaign, where more than 8,000 Australians lost their lives to little effect in what's become a major point in the Australian psyche. 60,000 of them lost their lives in the various phases of the First World War. And the interwar period saw the Great Depression hit Australia too, and they conducted a large-scale pest control operation known as the Emu War, which they lost. And again in the Second World War, the Australians fought in many theatres for their mother nation, with attacks from the Japanese in the north of the continent, and Darwin being bombed severely. There was intense fighting with the Japanese in the Pacific Theatre, and Australian prisoners of war were treated brutally. But after years of fighting largely alongside the forces of the United States, Australia began to understand its new position in the world, stepping back from relying on Britain. And so yeah, after years of fighting Hitler, they decided to be a bit less like the bloke, and allowed Australia's modern diverse population to form. And similarly to the United States, there's been an ongoing civil rights movement for the rights of the Aboriginal people. In 1986, British authority truly ended, and they remain in the Commonwealth for now and ceremonially recognise the British head of state. The Australians diversified their economy away from being purely based on agriculture and mining, and they established very close, and some argue too close, relations with East Asia, particularly China. And today Australia is a democratic, progressive country with generous social programs and is a hub of commerce. It's a great place to live and is known as the Lucky Country. Thanks for watching.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is...
Redback, funnel web, blue ringed octopus, taipan, tiger snake, adderbox, jellyfish, stonefish, and the poison thing that lives in a shell, the spicy when you pick it up. Come to Australia.